Hey everyone, Ryan from Pigeon Hill Brewing Company here to give you a brief overview on the science behind making beer. So beer is a very simple product. There is mainly only 4 ingredients in beer, which is water, which makes up most of our product that we make, malted barley, hops, and yeast. So a little bit about the brewing process. It starts, we crush the malted barley so we can get to the inside of the kernel. We mix it with warm water, and this is our first vessel that we brew into. It's called a mash tun. So we mix the hot water with the malted barley and make what we call a mash. It's very similar to oatmeal. And what will happen there is enzymes that are naturally found in the kernels of barley that were activated during the malting process will be reactivated by the warm water and start converting the starches that are inside the grain into simple sugars that the yeast can eat. After we're done mashing, we'll do a process called lautering or sparging, and basically what we're doing is we're rinsing off the grain. The grain will stay behind in the mash tun, and we will rinse the sweet liquid off of it, the sugar water, which is called wort. It's pronounced wort. It's spelled W-O-R-T. And what we will do is we will rinse that, and we're trying to get all the sugar off. So again, we'll use warm water or hot water, which will dissolve sugar quicker. We'll then transfer it to our second vessel, which is our boil kettle. Get a good shot of that.
Got a good shot.
Awesome. So the boil kettle serves 2 main purposes. One, we will flavor the beer, and we'll add our third ingredient, which is hops, and that will give beer its balance. Normally, if you did not add hops, beer would be very sweet. So hops add a bitterness to it, and that's from alpha and beta acids that are found naturally in the hop flower. That also does a process. When originally beer was made, they made it based on flavor. Now they've also found, after Pasteur did his work with milk and beer, that they're also sanitizing it. So when you boil, we're killing off any beer spoilers, wild yeast, wild bacteria that just are in the air around us every day. We boil it for an hour, and it will sanitize the wort and flavor the beer by adding hops. Then we pump over to our third vessel, which is a Whirlpool. And basically what will happen there is we will collect the wort in there, and it actually gets spinning. So it is centripetal force, I believe. It's either centripetal or centrifugal. I cannot remember exactly. But it will basically, all these solids that are in the beer will get collected towards the center, and then we can pull nice clean wort off the side of the tank. It'll go through our heat exchanger here, where cold water gets pumped through one side, and the hot wort gets pumped through the other. You see all the fins here. The water will never touch the wort, but it will cool the liquid down. The cool thing with our brew system is we recapture that water when the heat exchange happens. Transfer of heat, we'll recapture that, and that will become our next batch of beer. So you can see there's a lot of odd and end miscellaneous science that gets used in the brewing process. And again, this is super simple. Anybody has any questions, feel free to reach out. We're more than happy to answer any questions. So what we'll do is, after we've pumped through the heat exchanger, and the reason we use the heat exchanger is the beer in this vessel is 200 degrees, and the yeast, if we put yeast in that environment, the yeast would die instantly. The whole reason we boil it is to kill off any wild yeast that are naturally in the air. We want our strain, the type of yeast we use to be prolific, so we will pump it through here and make it at a temperature that the yeast is extremely happy. So if you want to follow me, we'll walk over to our cellar. So what we will do is we will pump, if you see these big red hoses, these are all food grade hoses. We heat sanitize these to transfer our beer, our wort from the brew system over to the cellar. And this is where it technically becomes beer. We will add our fourth ingredient to our beer here, which is yeast. And that's where the process of fermentation happens. And what happens during fermentation, it's very simple as an overview, but it's also very complex. Three main things happen during fermentation. The yeast eat the sugar that we've produced in the brewing process. They excrete ethanol, which gives beer its alcohol content. Also, a byproduct is carbon dioxide, and then they also generate heat. So as the fermentation process happens, it warms the liquid up. The yeast gets super happy. In the brewery, we do a couple of things. So if we want to walk over to this tank here, that's ferment. We have what we call an airlock, which allows, if you want to film down here, you can see it bubbling away. That is CO2 coming out from the fermentation process. So what that does, that allows CO2 to escape during fermentation, but also as the fermentation slows and the pressures change, it does not allow atmospheric air to go back into the tank. Air that can do two things on this side. It could add beer spoilers, which could make the beer taste bad, and could also, oxygen is beer's worst enemy. It'll start destroying it from the second it hits it. And then the heat. If you look up, all our tanks are what we call jacketed. They have a glycol product, which is food grade antifreeze, which never touches the beer, but it's still food grade if any were to ever interact. But it keeps the tanks, takes care of the heat generated by the fermentation process. So all the black piping you see, that's all glycol being pumped through. And the cool thing with that is we can have different tanks at different temperatures. So this tank actually has a lager in it. This tank is currently empty, but we could have this beer fermenting at, say, 68, 70 degrees. Oh, gimbal's coming around. 68, 70 degrees. This tank is in the 50s right now. So yeah, there's another little scientific thing. There's two main strains of yeast that beer ferments with. One is a lager strain, and that will ferment at the bottom of the tank. And then there's an ale strain, which will ferment more at the top. Ales ferment at a warmer temperature. They ferment at the top. The yeast is more active at the top. Lagers ferment colder, and the yeast ferments at the bottom. When we're done with the brewing process, the fermentation process is mostly done within, we'll say, a week. We'll let the yeast will go in, they'll eat all the sugar, or as much of the sugar as they can eat first, and create the ethanol. Then they'll go back. There's a lot of little off flavors, diacetyl, acetaldehyde. So diacetyl used to be used in movie theater popcorn. It's a buttery character, which is great on popcorn, not on beer. So after the yeast has eaten its sugars, it'll go back and clean up the diacetyl, or the precursors to diacetyl, clean up acetaldehyde. It will kind of go back and basically clean up its mess, so to speak. So we give it, usually most of our fermentations take about 2 weeks. So we want to make sure the beer is nice and clean. We'll do checks both with scientific, or with instruments, and we'll also do it via palate. There is no way to replicate a human palate as far as tasting with any product, but especially beer. So once we're done with that, we'll transfer it over to a finishing tank, and that's where it gets packaged. So if you walk with me one more time, we can either keg the beer or we can can it. This is our canning line, and as you can see, it has 4 separate heads that we can fill. We'll fill 4 cans at a time. The aluminum cans are lined with a food grade liner, and there's 2 separate parts to a can. There's the actual can itself, and then the lid. They come separate, and they get seamed together during the canning process. So, as I said earlier, oxygen is finished beer's worst enemy. So as the cans come down, they'll get purged with carbon dioxide. So here's another fun science thing. Carbon dioxide will sit heavier than atmospheric air. So as we fill the cans will get purged with CO2. The CO2 will fill from the bottom and essentially push most of the air that's in the can out. So when the cans get filled with beer, they have a nice pillow of CO2 that they're getting filled under, which helps protect the beer. From there, it comes and it picks up the lid and goes into our seamer where it gets seamed together and goes down for labeling and packaging. And then goes out to restaurants, stores, wherever it needs to go. Again, this is just a really simple, basic overview. We use science every day. In fact, our running joke around the production floor is if we would have known we would have used so much math and science, we would have paid better attention in school. So anyway, hopefully you guys found this informative. And like I said, any questions, feel free to reach out to us. We're more than happy to answer questions. Cheers, everybody. Thanks for listening.